we combat, both in the Patriots flying and in the Snowbirds flying, we combat the turbulence by applying forward trim pressure.
Welcome to Flying BC, a podcast about the people, planes, and aviation adventures in British Columbia and Canada, with your host, Warwick Patterson.
Welcome to a special bonus episode of Flying BC, where former Snowbird and CF-18 pilot Scratch Mitchell answers your listener questions. I'll be doing more of this sort of exclusive bonus content here on Patreon in the future. Our patrons will have an opportunity to get their questions in front of future guests. As always, the main podcast and videos will remain available to all, and if you feel like supporting the cause, I'd love to have you on board for the journey. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions for this one. I hope you enjoy this extra session with Scratch Mitchell. So yeah, we had some listener questions for you who came in before the show, and I just wanted to throw those out to you and get your answers on those.
Absolutely, happy to.
So the first one that came in from Nicholas. It's kind of a two-parter, so I'll ask two different questions here. But who creates a new season's show display, and does it change every year? This could be CF-18 or Snowbirds.
Okay, well, it's actually the same answer for in both cases, and I'll speak to the Snowbirds because I was more intimately involved with that as the lead. Effectively, the show changes subtly every year, and the team gets to pick that, how those changes come out. And so at the beginning of the season, we sit down and in my case, I like to do it as a sort of a group thing and say, okay, what could the show look like? And I like to get the input of the team members to their show as well. I think there's been other approaches in the past, but the way I approached it was let's all just throw our favorite maneuvers down on a board and see how we could integrate that into the show. I think for the uninitiated, the Snowbird show probably looks pretty similar year to year. And if we had to say there were 60, 75 different maneuvers that the Snowbirds fly in sort of the bag of tricks, if you will, then the show might consist of 35 or 40 of them. And that you harvest the different maneuvers out of the bag of tricks each year. And so I think there's some subtle changes, and certainly the experienced airshow fan would notice some of the maneuvers that have changed year to year. And then every once in a while there's an innovation where something comes along and it's like, wow, we haven't seen that. A few years ago, the team, I think it's about 4 or 5 years ago, they started doing that near the end of the show, that sort of whirly where they're all working around each other and the lights and the smoke all in random patterns as they're kind of winding. It looks like they're winding around themselves as they were coming. That was an innovation. It looked really good. It came out of just people sitting around coming up with great ideas. So the short answer of that is yes, the show changes every year, albeit subtly.
Cool. And I guess part two of that is how does an airshow performer set up turn and maneuver points at different airports with different landmarks and topography? When you show up somewhere new, how do you get the lay of the land, I guess?
Yeah, so that's a really important aspect of airshow flying, is every airshow has what's called the aerobatic box, and that's a superimposed box around the airshow environment. And that's a legal prerogative for the airshow organizer and the event organizer, but it's also a reference point for the performers. In some cases, some performers must stay within that box. If you think of like an aerobatic box, or a competitive box, they have to stay within it. The Snowbirds can't stay, flying high performance airplanes. You can't stay inside a 6,000 foot box, just by sheer physics. And so the goal is to perform the maneuvers in the aerobatic portion of the maneuvers inside that box. And so when we arrive, we first study the maps, and we study that superimposed box over the ground. We'll use Google Maps, we'll use paper maps, anything required and that's provided to us. And then we look at those reference points and study them, and we brief them very, very detailed way. And we'll go out on our practice day, and even before we initiate the initial practice, sometimes we'll just fly around, just orbit, and you'll see the snowbirds or the F-18, or in my civilian life, sometimes I'll just take off and just do a circle over the airfield. And I'll start looking at some of those reference points to make sure that those make sense with what I've studied on the map. And then we start building our routine out of that. And the routine doesn't change from site to site, but your reference points where you initiate some of the maneuvers and the timing points, you need a ground reference for some of those. So that's a very important aspect of it. And that's why we have practice days.
Nice. The Hangar Museum in Calgary posted a question. Do you prefer performing as part of a team or solo?
You know, I've received that question a few times, and I would say that's an impossible one to answer, because I've truly enjoyed doing both. I was the CF-18 demo pilot, and I absolutely loved the autonomy of that. I love just myself walking to the jet, getting in, strapping on, and performing, and all my indicators of a good show or not were as a result of how I performed that day, and I got that immediate feedback. But then you take it to the snowbirds, and I found there was a different level and different measures of what a good show was. And so I got fulfilled by the fact that sometimes you just felt the energy build and the team come together in those perfect moments, that the show just felt fantastic. And there was something about being part of the team that was, what's that expression, you know, the sum is greater than the sum of the individual parts. And that really did come to light. And so I've ebbed and flowed between solo performance and team performance, and I think I've struck that nice balance, you know, being an F-18 demo pilot, then snowbirds, and then I retired. I went to fly a solo F-86 routine, then I went with the Patriots jet team for 7 years, and then I've been flying a solo T-33, so I've really been ping-ponging off those two types of performances, and I would say equally fulfilling, but for different reasons.
Perfect. Then Michael, final question. What happens if there's turbulence while you're in type formation? How do you deal with that?
Turbulence is a tough one, and one of the interesting aspects of jet team flying, whether it's the Patriots or the Snowbirds, is the fact that you typically are near the end of the show because you're often the headline act. Well, at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a summer day, that's when all the convective heating starts. Usually the clouds start building, and that's when the most turbulence shows up. So it's nice to have that privileged position of being the headline act, but at the same time, you typically get the worst weather and the worst turbulence. So it actually is a challenge to fly in the turbulence. And so with the Snowbirds, we had different spacing levels. We would have a really tight spacing where we could fly up to 4 feet of wing overlap. The air had to be pretty smooth and comfortable, and as you went through the season, became more rehearsed, certainly with the newer pilots, your tolerance for the turbulence would change as a result. But we would have different levels of spacing depending on the turbulence and our level of comfort. And it was a lowest common denominator thing. Anyone had veto on the spacing. You could say, I just need to go a little wider, and we had some code words for that. And to space it out if we're bumping around. In a perfect world, the formation rides out the same bump the same time, and all 9 jets would just bounce in the same piece of air. But that isn't the case every time, and so one part of the formation might hit some turbulence where another one wouldn't, and so it sends ripples through the formation, and those are the more challenging turbulence situations. But we combat. Both in the Patriots flying and in the Snowbirds flying, we combat the turbulence by applying forward trim pressure. And so in the Snowbirds, because of the low wing loading on those type of airplanes, trainer type airplanes, the airplanes react to the turbulence because they create more lift for the wing. And like as compared to flying an F5, which has a very high wing loading, the airplane has to go really fast to create the lift, so it cuts through the turbulence really well. But with the Snowbird jet and the Tudor, that low wing loading, it really responds to the the air and the turbulence. So to counteract that, as I was saying, we put a lot of forward pressure. In some cases, in heavy turbulence, depending on the position you're flying, and I was an outer the first time, I would put upwards of 20, 25 pounds of forward stick pressure. And then what that does is it dampens out the bumps because there's a positive force on the airplane trying to make the airplane bunt over. And so in flying, the formation is just varying degrees of forward stick pressure that you're using rather than pushing and pulling. And so that does tend to dampen it out. So you'll find snowbird pilots typically have a larger right forearm than a left forearm. And I still have a muscle that's slightly larger for my right. I'm flying 3 years on the wing of the snowbirds, and being in the outer position, we carried a lot of trim to be able to react to the larger moment arms of being further out in the formation. So turbulence is a tough part of the business, but we fight through it. Like I say, there's no crying in baseball.
Yeah. Cool. Well, those are good questions from our listeners, so I'm glad we were able to get those in.
My pleasure.
So that's it for this bonus episode. Thanks for your support and follows on Instagram and Facebook at Flying British Columbia. Stay tuned for more videos and podcasts coming soon.